In 1896, an Italian army marched into the highlands of East Africa to claim a country, and it was destroyed. Not defeated on points, not fought to a truce, but broken in a single day at a place called Adwa by soldiers under an emperor most of Europe had never taken seriously. It is the only time in the entire scramble for Africa that a European power tried to take a country and simply failed. And it is the reason Ethiopia is the one large African state that never spent a century under somebody else's flag. That victory shaped everything that came after it, including the problems the country is still trying to solve today. The emperor was Menelik II, and what he did next mattered as much as the battle. He used the weapons and the prestige he had won to expand in every direction, absorbing kingdoms, peoples, and languages that had never been ruled from the highlands before and roughly doubling the size of his state. The modern borders of Ethiopia are essentially the ones he drew. So is the modern question of Ethiopian politics, because a country assembled that quickly from that many different nations has been arguing ever since about what exactly holds it together. His successor is the one the world remembers. Haile Selassie was crowned in 1930, the last emperor in a line that claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba, and for 40 years he was the face of Africa to everyone outside it. He wrote Ethiopia its first constitution, abolished slavery on paper, opened schools, and put the country into the League of Nations. Then, in 1935, Mussolini invaded with aircraft and poison gas, and the emperor went to Geneva to ask the League to enforce its own rules. It refused, more or less, and the speech he gave there became famous for a line that turned out to be exactly right. He warned the assembled powers that what was being done to his country would be done to them next. 4 years later, it was. Ethiopia was occupied for 5 years rather than colonized for a century, and in 1941, Selassie returned to a throne that no other African leader of that era could claim to have kept. That combination, a black emperor, an ancient church, and a country that had never been conquered, did something in the wider world that nobody planned. In Jamaica in the 1930s, groups of believers took the emperor's pre-coronation name, Ras Tafari, and built a religious movement around him, treating a living African monarch as a messianic figure. Rastafari spread through the Caribbean and then, through reggae, across the entire planet. When Selassie visited Jamaica in 1966, an enormous crowd came to meet a man many of them regarded as divine. He was, by all accounts, somewhat baffled by it. The reality inside the country was harder than the symbol outside it. By the 1970s, Ethiopia was still overwhelmingly rural. Land was concentrated in the hands of the church and the nobility, and an emperor in his 80s was presiding over a famine his government tried to conceal. When a British documentary showed that famine to the world in 1973, next to footage of imperial banquets, the myth of great Ethiopia collapsed from the inside. Within a year, the army had removed him. What replaced him was one of the most radical revolutions Africa has seen. A committee of junior officers known as the Derg took power in 1974, declared a Marxist state, nationalized the land, and executed much of the old ruling class. Selassie died in custody the following year in circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. Power consolidated around Mengistu Haile Mariam, and between 1976 and 1978, the campaign known as the Red Terror killed people on a scale that Ethiopians still count in the tens of thousands. Then came 1984. A drought hit a country already exhausted by war with Eritrean and Tigrayan insurgents, and a government that was restricting aid to rebel areas and forcibly resettling farmers turned a bad harvest into a catastrophe. Estimates of the dead run from several 100,000 upwards. A television report from the north reached British screens in October of that year, and within weeks a famine in the Ethiopian highlands had become the largest charitable mobilization in the history of popular music, with Band Aid, Live Aid, and a global audience discovering the country through the worst thing that had ever happened to it. That is the image most people outside Africa still carry, and it is 40 years out of date. It is also worth being precise about the cause because the drought was real, but the famine was political. Food existed in Ethiopia during those years, It could not reach the people who needed it, partly because of the terrain, partly because of the war, and substantially because the government chose which regions to feed. The Derg fell in 1991 to a coalition of rebel movements, and the group at the center of it came from Tigray, the northernmost region, with a population of around 6% of the country. Its leader, Haile Zenawi, ran Ethiopia for the next 21 years, and the decision his government made in 1995 is the one that still defines Ethiopian politics. The new constitution redrew the country as a federation of ethnic states, with regions defined by language and nationality, each formally holding the right to secede. The logic was that a state assembled by Menelik out of many nations could only hold together if each of those nations was given its own territory and its own status. The risk was equally obvious. If every group has a homeland and a legal right to leave, then every dispute about land, language, or office becomes a dispute between nations rather than within one, and the country's politics organizes itself along exactly the lines most likely to break it. Ethiopians have been arguing about that trade-off for 30 years, and it is not an academic argument. The first thing the new arrangement produced was the loss of the sea. Eritrea, which had fought its own 30-year war, voted for independence in 1993, and the border that appeared cut Ethiopia off from the Red Sea completely. A country the size of France and Spain combined became landlocked overnight through a peaceful referendum. 5 years later, the two former allies fought a border war so brutal that tens of thousands died over territory of almost no value, and the ports Ethiopia had just lost were closed to it entirely. Here is what that costs, measured rather than asserted. I took the real coastlines and the real borders and calculated it directly. The average square kilometer of Ethiopian territory sits 513 kilometers from the nearest saltwater. Addis Ababa is 535 kilometers from the coast in a straight line, and the road that actually reaches a working harbor is nearly twice that. 16 African countries have no sea access at all, holding 332 million people between them, and their combined output works out to $884 a head against $2,219 for the African countries that do reach the coast. That gap of 2.5 times is computed identically for both groups. What Melis built on top of that geography was a developmental state modeled openly on East Asia. Land stayed in government hands, the state directed credit, and enormous sums went into roads, dams, universities, and a railway. It worked, at least by the numbers, and Ethiopia posted growth close to 10% a year for a decade and a half, among the fastest sustained runs recorded anywhere. It also stayed authoritarian throughout, and in the 2010 election, the ruling coalition and its allies won every seat but one in parliament. Meles died in 2012. His successor lasted 6 years, and by 2015, the country was in sustained protest, driven mainly by the Oromo, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, and one that felt it had been governed by others for a century. By early 2018, the protests had not stopped. The prime minister resigned, and the ruling coalition had to find someone who could hold the country together. The man they chose was not the obvious candidate. Abiy Ahmed was in his early 40s, an Oromo from a Muslim father and an Orthodox Christian mother, a former Army intelligence officer who had worked on cybersecurity and later ran a federal agency. He was young enough to be unknown to most of the country and connected enough to be acceptable to the people who mattered. What nobody anticipated was how fast he would move. Within his first 6 months, he released political prisoners, lifted the ban on opposition parties, allowed exiled media back into the country, apologized on behalf of the state for past abuses, and appointed a cabinet that was half women. He created a ministry of peace. He talked constantly about a philosophy of togetherness he called metamor, and for a period in 2018, the mood in Ethiopia was close to euphoric. The biggest move was towards Eritrea, two countries that had been locked in a frozen war for 20 years, with families divided and no flights, no phone lines, and no trade between them, made peace in a matter of weeks. Embassies reopened. The first commercial flight from Addis Ababa to Asmara in 2 decades landed to crowds. In October 2019, Abiy Ahmed was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and the citation named that reconciliation specifically. Then the same year, he did something that looked administrative and turned out to be the hinge of everything after it. He dissolved the ruling coalition, which had been an alliance of four ethnically based parties, and replaced it with a single national organization called the Prosperity Party. Most of the coalition joined. The Tigrayan Party, which had dominated Ethiopian politics for 27 years and had just been displaced from the center of it, refused. You can read that dissolution two ways, and both readings are held sincerely by large numbers of Ethiopians. One is that a country cannot function when its ruling party is a bargain between ethnic blocs, and that replacing it with a single national party was the only way past a system that turned every argument into a national question. The other is that ethnic federalism was the settlement that ended a civil war, that dismantling its political expression concentrated power in one office, and that the regions were being stripped of the guarantees they had been given in 1995. The dispute became concrete over an election. The federal government postponed the 2020 vote citing the pandemic. Tigray held its own regional election anyway in September of that year. The federal parliament declared it illegitimate, and each government stopped recognizing the other. In November, fighting began around a federal military base in the region, and within days, Ethiopia was in a full civil war in its own north. The war lasted 2 years, and it was catastrophic. Credible estimates of the dead run into the hundreds of thousands from fighting, hunger, and the collapse of medical care. Millions were displaced. Eritrean forces entered on the federal side, which is its own remarkable turn given what those two states had been to each other. Communications and aid to the region were cut for long stretches. A peace agreement signed in Pretoria in November 2022 has largely held in Tigray itself, but the country has faced continued armed conflict since in Amhara and in Oromia. So, the Nobel laureate presided over one of the deadliest wars of the century so far, 4 years after the prize. That sentence is uncomfortable in both directions, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving quickly, because the man who opened the prisons and the man who prosecuted that war is the same man, and any account that keeps only one of them is not describing Ethiopia. Through all of it, one project kept going, and it is the one thing almost every faction in the country supports. Construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam began in 2011 on the Blue Nile a few kilometers from the Sudanese border. It is the largest hydroelectric scheme in Africa, around 145 meters high, with a reservoir holding roughly 74 billion cubic meters and generating capacity now given as about 5,000 megawatts. It was paid for largely from inside the country through bonds and deductions from salaries because international lenders would not finance a project Egypt objected to. The objection is not trivial, and the geography explains it. The Blue Nile rises at Lake Tana in the Ethiopian highlands, and once you add the Atbara and the Sobat, the Ethiopian contribution to the Nile is usually put at around 85% of the total flow. Egypt, with more than 100 million people, draws nearly all of its fresh water from that river. Agreements signed in 1929 and 1959 divided that water between Egypt and Sudan and gave Ethiopia nothing, which is less surprising when you notice Ethiopia was not party to either. Egypt's case is that filling a reservoir this size upstream during a run of dry years threatens the water supply of 100 million people, and that it needs a binding agreement on drought rather than an assurance. Ethiopia's case is that a state may develop rivers rising in its own territory, that a hydroelectric dam passes water through rather than consuming it, and that treaties signed while it was excluded cannot bind it. Sudan sits between them and has changed position more than once. A declaration of principles was signed in 2015, and years of talks followed without a binding agreement. The reservoir was filled anyway, in stages, and the turbines started in 2022. The strategic logic behind it is the same logic that runs through this entire story. Electricity is the one major export that does not need a port. A landlocked country cannot ship a container without somebody else's harbor, but it can push power across a border on a wire, and Ethiopia now sells electricity to Djibouti, Sudan, and Kenya. For a state whose central constraint is distance from saltwater, generating a commodity that travels by cable is close to the only export strategy the map allows. Everything else still has to reach a ship, and that is where the map bites hardest. Roughly 95% of Ethiopian trade passes through the port of Djibouti, a country of fewer than 1 million people that has built its entire economy on that position and on renting land to foreign militaries. The electrified railway from Addis Ababa runs 756 kilometers to that port, built with Chinese loans and opened in 2018, and its whole value depends on the goodwill of the state at the far end. Which is why in early 2024, Ethiopia signed a memorandum with Somaliland, the unrecognized state on the Gulf of Aden, reportedly trading recognition for access to the port of Berbera. Somalia treated it as an act of aggression, and the region spent a year absorbing the consequences before Turkish mediation cooled it. From Addis Ababa, Berbera is 705 kilometers away in a straight line. The Ethiopian argument was never about which flag flies over the harbor. It was that a country of 130 million people cannot accept one foreign port as its only door forever. The money for the railway, the roads, and much of the grid came largely from China, and the bill arrived on schedule. In December 2023, Ethiopia missed a payment on its international bond and entered default, and it has been restructuring since, with Chinese state lenders and private bondholders at the same table. Building a state on borrowed money is ordinary. Doing it while the exports that repay the loans are throttled by somebody else's harbor is not. One part of the strategy has worked without qualification, and it fits the pattern exactly. Ethiopian Airlines is the largest carrier in Africa by fleet, destinations, and passengers. It is consistently profitable, it is state-owned, and it has made Addis Ababa the main connecting hub between Africa and the rest of the world. It succeeded because an airline does not need a coastline. Aviation is the one network where sitting in the middle of a landmass at altitude, halfway between Europe and Asia, is an advantage rather than a penalty. Addis Ababa also hosts the headquarters of the African Union, which gives a landlocked country a permanent seat at the center of continental politics, regardless of its income per head. So what is Ethiopia actually building? Strip away the slogans, and the bet is that 3 assets the geography genuinely provides, which are water, altitude, and people, can be converted into the 2 things the geography denies, which are export earnings and access to the sea. Electricity crosses borders on wires. Aircraft cross them in the air. Diplomatic weight does not need to cross them at all. Manufacturing is the piece that still has to travel by ship, and manufacturing is exactly the piece that keeps colliding with the same road to somebody else's port. Is that a superpower? No, and it is worth saying plainly. The economy is small in absolute terms. Output per person is among the lowest in the world. Most of the workforce is still in subsistence farming, and the country has come through a devastating war and a sovereign default in the same 3 years. Regional power is the honest phrase, and even that describes a direction rather than an arrival. But regional power in this neighborhood is not a small thing. A state of 130 million people with the largest generating capacity in East Africa, the continent's dominant airline, the African Union on its doorstep, and physical control of the headwaters of the Nile has real leverage over everyone around it, whatever its income per head. That combination exists nowhere else on the continent, and it is why Egypt, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, and Djibouti all watch what Addis Ababa does next far more closely than its economic size alone would justify. And underneath the dams and the ports and the loans, the argument Ethiopia is actually having is the one Menelik started. Is this a single nation that happens to contain many peoples, or a federation of nations that happen to share a state? Haile Selassie answered one way and was overthrown. Derg answered the same way with tanks and fell. Haile's answered the opposite way and built a constitution around it. Abiy answered the first way again, and the North went to war. 130 years after Adwa, the country that was never conquered from outside is still deciding what it is on the inside, and no dam anywhere on the Blue Nile will settle that question for it. Everything geographic in this video was measured directly from boundary and coastline data rather than taken from somebody else's summary. And the historical figures, the dam specifications, and the war estimates are set out with their sources in the description. If you want to argue with any of it, the comments are open and I read every one. If you enjoyed this, the next video takes another country whose history explains more about its map than its map does about its history.